I was watching my wife accept her award when her ex-husband grabbed my shoulder. She settled for less. I turned around and said, "She upgraded, actually." He raised his fist. What he didn't know was I'd been training MMA fighters for a decade. Security escorted him out on a stretcher. The applause was still echoing through the ballroom when I felt his fingers dig into my trapezius muscle. Not a tap, not a friendly gesture. A grip. The kind of grip that says I want your attention and I don't care if it hurts. I was in the third row of the Meridian Grand Hotel ballroom, watching my wife Camille walk across the stage to accept the Women in Architecture Excellence Award, the highest honor in her field, when the smell of bourbon and expensive cologne invaded my space from behind. The hand on my shoulder tightened. I didn't turn around immediately. I wanted to see her face when they handed her the crystal trophy. Wanted to watch the moment she'd worked 15 years to achieve. But then I heard his voice, low and venomous, cutting through the applause like a knife through silk. She settled for less. That's when I turned. And that's when I saw Graham Whitfield for the first time in 6 years, my wife's ex-husband, standing in the aisle with murder in his eyes and whiskey on his breath. My name is Dominic Reyes. I'm 41 years old. For the past 11 years, I've owned and operated Ironclad Athletics in downtown Portland, a mixed martial arts training facility that's produced 3 UFC fighters, 2 Bellator champions, and more amateur champions than I can count. Before that, I fought professionally for 7 years. Middleweight division, went 23-4 before a torn ACL ended my competitive career at 29. I've trained alongside some of the most dangerous people on the planet. I've been choked unconscious more times than I can remember. I've had my nose broken 4 times, my orbital socket fractured twice, and my ribs cracked so often they've developed their own weather system. None of that prepared me for the hatred I saw in Graham Whitfield's eyes that night. Because fighting in a cage is different from fighting someone who wants to destroy you. In the cage, there are rules, referees, tap-outs. In real life, there's just survival. Camille and I met 8 years ago at a charity fundraiser for underprivileged youth athletics. She was there representing her architecture firm, which had designed the new community center pro bono. I was there because my gym had donated training sessions and equipment. She was standing by the silent auction table, examining a painting with the kind of focused intensity that made everyone else in the room disappear. I walked over to introduce myself. 3 hours later, we were still talking in the corner of the ballroom, oblivious to the fact that the event had ended and the catering staff was cleaning up around us. She told me later that she almost didn't come that night. She was still recovering from her divorce, still rebuilding the confidence that Graham had systematically dismantled over 7 years of marriage. She'd been told by her therapist that she needed to start engaging with the world again, that isolation was feeding her depression. So she forced herself to attend, one event, one night, no expectations. And then she met me. I didn't know about Graham at first. Camille mentioned an ex-husband in passing, the way you mention a car accident you survived years ago. Something that happened, something that hurt, something you'd rather not discuss in detail. I didn't push. Everyone has a past. I certainly did. 2 failed relationships, a drinking problem I'd conquered in my late 20s, a father who'd walked out when I was 12. We all carry scars. It wasn't until we'd been dating for 6 months that she told me the truth. We were lying in bed, post-midnight, the kind of quiet that invites confession. Graham didn't hit me, she said. Not physically, but he broke me in every other way. I listened without interrupting as she described 7 years of psychological warfare, the constant criticism disguised as helpful feedback, the isolation from friends and family, the financial control, the emotional manipulation, the gaslighting so sophisticated she'd started to believe she was genuinely losing her mind. He convinced me I was worthless, she whispered, that no one else would ever want me, that I was lucky he stayed. By the end, I believed him. Graham Whitfield came from old money. His grandfather had founded Whitfield Development, one of the largest commercial real estate companies in the Pacific Northwest. His father had expanded it into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Graham had inherited a trust fund at 21 that most people couldn't earn in 10 lifetimes. He'd also inherited his father's cruelty, his grandfather's entitlement, and a fundamental belief that the world existed to serve him. He met Camille when she was 24, fresh out of architecture school, working as a junior designer at a small firm. She was brilliant, ambitious, beautiful, and completely naive about men like Graham. He pursued her with the full force of his considerable resources. Private jets to Paris for weekend getaways, a 3-carat engagement ring after 4 months of dating, promises of a partnership in his family's development company where she could design buildings that would reshape the Portland skyline. She said yes because she thought she was in love. She didn't realize until years later that Graham didn't want a partner. He wanted a possession. The abuse started small, so small she didn't recognize it at first. Comments about her weight, her clothes, her friends, suggestions that she didn't really need to work, that her salary was embarrassing compared to his income, that a woman in her position should focus on supporting her husband's career. He convinced her to quit her job at the architecture firm, convinced her that she didn't need her own bank account, that joint finances showed trust and commitment, convinced her that her college friends were jealous of her success and that her family was using her for access to his money. Within 3 years, she was completely isolated. No job, no savings, no support system. Just Graham and the gilded cage he'd built around her. He controlled everything: what she wore, who she saw, how she spent her time. He monitored her phone, her email, her social media. He gave her an allowance that he could revoke at any moment for any reason. And through it all, he maintained the facade of the perfect husband: generous, devoted, a pillar of the community. No one outside their marriage suspected a thing. The night she finally left, he'd been drinking. More than usual. She'd mentioned wanting to visit her mother, who was recovering from hip surgery 3 hours away. Graham had said no. Said her mother was manipulative, that the surgery was probably an excuse to lure Camille back under her influence. When Camille pushed back, gently, carefully, the way she'd learned to navigate his moods, something in him snapped. He didn't hit her. He never did. But he cornered her in the kitchen, his face inches from hers, and described in clinical detail what would happen if she ever tried to leave him. How he would destroy her professionally. How he would turn their mutual friends against her. How his lawyers would ensure she left with nothing, not a penny, not a possession, not a shred of dignity. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that he knew people. People who could make problems disappear. It wasn't a direct threat. Graham was too smart for that. But the implication was clear. She waited until he passed out, packed a single bag, and drove to a women's shelter she'd found online months earlier, just in case. She filed for divorce the next morning. The divorce took 18 months. Graham fought every step of the way, not because he wanted her back, but because he couldn't stand to lose. He hired the most expensive lawyers in the state, dragged out proceedings with endless motions and delays, tried to paint Camille as mentally unstable, a gold digger, an unfaithful wife. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter to Graham. What mattered was control, was winning, was making sure Camille paid for the crime of leaving him. In the end, she walked away with almost nothing. A small settlement that barely covered her legal fees. No alimony, despite 7 years of marriage. Graham's lawyers had buried her in paperwork and depositions until she was too exhausted to fight. She signed the final documents just to make it stop. Just to be free. She told me once that she considered it a victory anyway. I got out alive, she said. That's more than some women can say. When I met Camille, she was rebuilding. She'd started her own architecture firm with a business loan and a determination that bordered on obsessive. She worked 18-hour days, took projects no one else wanted, underbid competitors just to get her name out there. Within 5 years, she'd established herself as one of the most innovative architects in the region. Her designs won awards. Her firm grew from a one-woman operation to a team of 30. She was featured in industry publications, invited to speak at conferences, consulted on major civic projects. Everything Graham had tried to crush in her had not only survived, but flourished. And then, 6 years after the divorce, she received the nomination for the Women in Architecture Excellence Award. The ceremony was black tie, 400 guests, held at the Meridian Grand Hotel in downtown Portland. Her entire team was there. Her mother, finally recovered and fiercely proud. Her brother Elijah and his wife, who'd flown in from Chicago. And me, her husband of 3 years, sitting in the third row with tears in my eyes as she walked across that stage. I should have known Graham would find out. The nomination had been announced 3 months earlier, covered in all the industry publications and the local business news. Camille's face was everywhere, her success impossible to ignore. For a man like Graham, a man who'd told her she was worthless, who'd predicted she'd fail without him, who'd tried to destroy her rather than let her go, her triumph must have been unbearable. I later learned he'd crashed the event. He wasn't on the guest list, but his name still carried weight in Portland, still opened doors. He'd shown up in a tuxedo, flashed his family name at the registration desk, and talked his way into the ballroom. He'd been drinking at the bar in the back for an hour before he approached me, watching, waiting, building up the liquid courage to confront the woman who'd escaped him and the man she'd chosen instead. She settled for less. That's what he said when I turned around. Up close, Graham looked exactly like his photos, but somehow diminished. Handsome in that generic wealthy way, all jaw and cheekbones and professionally whitened teeth. But there was something hollow behind his eyes, something desperate. He was 46, but looked 55, the years of drinking and bitterness etched into his face. His tuxedo was expensive but disheveled, his tie loosened, his eyes bloodshot. He was swaying slightly, that particular sway of a man who's had too much, but thinks he's hiding it well. I looked at his hand on my shoulder, then back at his face. "I'm sorry," I said calmly. "Do I know you?" His grip tightened. "You know exactly who I am. You're sleeping with my wife." I removed his hand from my shoulder with a simple wrist manipulation, nothing dramatic, just enough to break his grip without escalating. "Ex-wife," I corrected. "And I'm married to her, actually. Have been for 3 years." Graham's face contorted into something ugly. 3 years of what? Playing house with my leftovers? I could feel the eyes of nearby guests turning toward us, could hear the whispers starting. On stage, Camille was giving her acceptance speech, unaware of the confrontation happening in the audience. I kept my voice low, controlled. "Mr. Whitfield, I suggest you leave before you embarrass yourself further." He laughed, a bitter sound that carried further than I would have liked. "Embarrass myself? Do you know who I am? Do you know who my family is? I could buy this hotel. I could buy you." He stepped closer, invading my space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. Instead, it just gave me a better sense of his balance, his weight distribution, his likely reaction time. Old habits from the cage. I smiled. You couldn't afford me. And you definitely can't afford her. Not anymore. That's when his mask slipped completely. She's nothing, he hissed. Nothing. A mediocre architect with delusions of grandeur. Everything she has because of me. Because I made her. Because I gave her opportunities she never could have earned on her own. I felt something cold settle in my chest. The same calm that used to descend before a fight, the still center in the middle of the storm. From the stage, I heard Camille's voice, thanking her team, her family, her supporters. I didn't look away from Graham. You didn't make her, I said quietly. You tried to break her. There's a difference. His eyes narrowed. What did she tell you? Her victim stories? Her lies about how I treated her? She's a manipulator, a narcissist. She's got you fooled like she fooled everyone else. I've seen the police reports, I said. The therapist evaluations. The emails. She didn't tell me anything that wasn't documented. His face went pale, then red. Those were sealed. Doesn't matter. I know what you are. She upgraded, actually. That's what I said next. And I meant every word. Camille hadn't settled for less when she chose me. She'd chosen someone who saw her clearly, who supported her ambitions, who would never try to diminish her light to make himself feel brighter. She'd chosen a partner instead of a captor. And standing there in that ballroom, watching Graham Whitfield unravel in real time, I felt nothing but gratitude that she'd found the strength to escape him. Graham's face twisted into something primal. Upgraded? To what? A washed-up cage fighter who runs a sweaty gym? You're a joke? A nobody. She'll realize it eventually. They always do. I shrugged. Maybe. But at least she's happy. When's the last time you made anyone happy, Graham? Including yourself? He swung at me. There are two types of punches in the world. Technical punches, thrown by people who've trained, who understand leverage and rotation, and how to generate power from the ground up. And wild punches, thrown by people who've seen fighting in movies and think anger is an adequate substitute for skill. Graham threw the second kind. A looping right hand that started somewhere around his ear and telegraphed itself so clearly I could have read a book while waiting for it to arrive. I slipped left, letting his fist sail past my chin by a comfortable margin. His momentum carried him forward, off balance. I could have ended it there. A simple trip, a push, let gravity do the work. That would have been the smart play, the measured response. But I thought about Camille, about 7 years of psychological torture, about the threats, the isolation, the systematic destruction of her self-worth, about all the nights she still woke up from nightmares, still flinched at loud voices, still struggled to believe she deserved good things. And I decided that Graham Whitfield deserved more than a stumble. I stepped into his recovery, timing the movement with the precision that 11 years of training had burned into my nervous system. My left hand shot out, a jab that caught him square on the nose. Not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to make his eyes water, to stun him, to let him know that whatever he thought was about to happen was not going to go the way he'd imagined. He stumbled backward, hands going to his face, a look of pure shock replacing the arrogance. You hit me, he said, almost wonderingly. Then the shock turned to rage. I'll kill you, he charged, bull-rushing the way untrained fighters do when they're hurt and angry, all forward momentum and no defense. I sprawled automatically, dropping my hips and driving my shoulder into his chest, redirecting his energy downward. He hit the floor hard, the wind rushing out of him in a grunt that silenced the nearby tables. Before he could recover, I transitioned to mount, my knees on either side of his ribs, my weight pinning him to the carpet. The next 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes. Graham thrashed beneath me, trying to buck me off, throwing wild punches from his back that had no power and no accuracy. I controlled his wrists easily, letting him exhaust himself. Around us, I could hear chaos erupting. Screams, shouts, the sound of chairs scraping. But I kept my focus on Graham, on his wild eyes, on the fear that was finally replacing the arrogance. Let me up, he gasped. I'll sue you. I'll have you arrested. You're done. I leaned close enough that only he could hear me. You ever come near her again? I said quietly. And a lawsuit will be the least of your problems. Then I stood up, stepped back, and let hotel security take over. They arrived in force, 4 men in black suits who looked more confused than competent. 2 of them helped Graham to his feet. His nose was bleeding, his tuxedo was ruined, and there was a wild, desperate look in his eyes that suggested he was contemplating another charge. But one of the security guards, a large man with the build and bearing of former military, put a firm hand on his chest. Sir, you need to leave. Graham pointed at me with a shaking finger. He assaulted me. I want him arrested. I want him charged. I want the security guard cut him off. Sir, I saw what happened. You threw the first punch. We have cameras everywhere. Now you can leave voluntarily, or we can call the police and let them sort it out. Graham's mouth opened and closed. He looked around the room, at the hundreds of faces staring at him, at the phones that had inevitably appeared to record his humiliation. His eyes found Camille on the stage, frozen mid-sentence, her trophy clutched in her hands, her face a mask of horror and recognition. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. He made it about 20 feet before his legs gave out. I hadn't hit him hard enough to cause that. A jab and a takedown shouldn't have resulted in anything more than bruised pride and maybe a sore back. But Graham had been drinking heavily, probably for hours before he approached me. When he went down the second time, he went down hard, catching the edge of a table on his way and hitting the floor in a crumpled heap. He didn't get up. The security guards rushed over, and I heard one of them radio for medical assistance. Then someone was at my side, grabbing my arm, and I turned to see Camille, her trophy abandoned, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief, and something I couldn't quite identify. "What happened?" she asked. "I told you," I said. He threw the first punch. She looked past me to where hotel staff were now surrounding Graham's unconscious form. "Is he okay?" I glanced back. "Honestly, I don't know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she squeezed my arm. "Thank you." I pulled her close, felt her trembling against my chest. "You don't need to thank me for protecting you. That's what husbands do." The paramedics arrived within minutes. Graham was conscious by then, but groggy, combative with the EMTs trying to assess him. He kept insisting he was fine, that he didn't need help, that he was going to destroy everyone involved in this conspiracy against him. But when he tried to stand, he nearly collapsed again, and one of the paramedics, a woman who introduced herself as Lucia Okonkwo, with 12 years of emergency response experience, firmly informed him that he was going to the hospital whether he liked it or not. "His blood pressure is dangerously elevated," she told the security team, "and he's showing signs of alcohol poisoning on top of whatever happened here. We're transporting him to Providence, Portland." They loaded him onto a stretcher while he continued to threaten everyone within earshot. As they wheeled him toward the exit, he made eye contact with me one last time. "This isn't over," he said. "Not even close." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The police arrived shortly after, 2 officers who took statements from me, from Camille, from the security guards, and from about a dozen witnesses who had seen Graham grab me, heard his verbal assault, and watched him throw the first punch. Officer Diana Krause, a 15-year veteran of the Portland Police Bureau, pulled me aside after she'd gathered the basics. "Mr. Reyes, I've reviewed the security footage. You're clearly acting in self-defense. That said, Mr. Whitfield is connected. His family has lawyers who make problems go away. Are you prepared for what might come?" I appreciated her honesty. "I've dealt with bullies before, officer, in the cage and out of it. They only have power if you give it to them." She smiled slightly. "That's a healthy attitude. For what it's worth, I hope you're right." Then she handed me her card. "If you need anything, if he contacts you, if anything feels off, call me directly." I took the card and thanked her. It would not be the last time I spoke with Officer Krause. The rest of the evening was a blur. The ceremony organizers, understandably shaken, offered to reschedule Camille's acceptance speech. She declined. Instead, she returned to the stage, composed herself, and delivered the most powerful speech I've ever heard. "I want to thank everyone who believed in me," she said, her voice steady, despite everything. "And I want to acknowledge something that just happened. Some of you may know that my ex-husband crashed this event tonight, that he tried to intimidate me and the people I love, that he failed." She paused, and the room was absolutely silent. I spent 7 years being told I was worthless, 7 years being convinced that I couldn't succeed without someone else's permission. It took me a long time to unlearn those lies. But I did. And tonight, standing here with this award, surrounded by people who saw my potential when I couldn't see it myself, I want to say this to anyone who's ever been made to feel small. You are enough. You always were. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. Graham was discharged from the hospital the next morning with a diagnosis of acute alcohol intoxication, minor contusions, and severe hypertension that his doctors said required immediate lifestyle changes. He was also served with a trespassing notice from the Meridian Grand Hotel and informed that he was banned from all future events. But that was just the beginning of his problems. Within 48 hours, video of the incident had gone viral. Multiple guests had recorded various portions of the confrontation, and someone had edited them together into a comprehensive 3-minute clip that showed everything. Graham grabbing my shoulder, his verbal abuse, his wild swing, my defensive response, and his subsequent collapse. The video accumulated over 2 million views in its first week. Comments ranged from supportive to brutal. Most people correctly identified Graham as the aggressor. A few accused me of excessive force, but they were drowned out by the majority, who pointed out that I'd exercised remarkable restraint given the circumstances. Graham's response to the viral attention was characteristically tone-deaf. He held a press conference outside his family's corporate headquarters, flanked by expensive lawyers, and announced that he was filing civil and criminal charges against me for assault, battery, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He claimed that I had attacked him without provocation, that the videos had been selectively edited to make him look bad, and that he was the victim of a coordinated smear campaign orchestrated by Camille and her feminist allies. The press conference was a disaster. Reporters immediately challenged his version of events with questions about the security footage, the witness statements, the fact that multiple camera angles showed him throwing the first punch. Graham's lawyers tried to redirect, but Graham himself couldn't resist engaging. He called Camille a psychopath. He called me a thug. He suggested that the Women in Architecture Excellence Award was a meaningless participation trophy. By the time his lawyers finally pulled him away from the microphones, he'd done more damage to his own case than my legal team could have achieved in months. Attorney Priscilla Thornton, senior partner at Thornton & Associates, and one of the most respected civil litigators in Oregon, called me the afternoon after Graham's press conference. "Mr. Reyes," she said without preamble, "I've been following your situation with interest. I'd like to offer my services pro bono." I was confused. Why pro bono? Because Graham Whitfield and his family have been bullying people in this city for decades. His father settled 3 sexual harassment lawsuits out of court. His grandfather was known for predatory business practices that destroyed small competitors. And Graham himself has a history of aggressive behavior toward women that has been systematically covered up by family money and legal intimidation. She paused. "I've been waiting a long time for someone to stand up to them publicly. You did that. The least I can do is make sure you don't suffer for it." I accepted her offer. Over the following weeks, Priscilla proved to be worth every penny I wasn't paying her. Graham's civil suit was filed within 2 weeks of the incident, a massive document alleging assault, battery, defamation, conspiracy, and a dozen other claims that Priscilla dismissed as legal theater designed to intimidate rather than succeed. The criminal complaint he'd filed with the police had already been rejected by the district attorney's office, which cited clear evidence of self-defense and declined to prosecute. But civil court operated by different rules, and Graham's lawyers clearly intended to bury us in paperwork and depositions until we either settled or went bankrupt. They underestimated Priscilla Thornton. Within a month, she had filed a countersuit on my behalf and Camille's, alleging harassment, stalking, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and defamation. More importantly, she had begun discovery. And what that discovery revealed would ultimately destroy Graham Whitfield far more thoroughly than any punch I could have thrown. The deposition transcripts were devastating. Under oath, Graham was forced to acknowledge details of his marriage to Camille that he'd spent years denying. The financial control, the isolation from friends and family, the verbal abuse that multiple witnesses, including former housekeeping staff and a family driver named Jeffrey Molina, who'd worked for the Whitfields for 23 years, were willing to testify to under oath. Jeffrey's deposition was particularly damning. He described driving Camille to medical appointments for stress-related conditions, picking her up from locations where Graham had stranded her as punishment, and overhearing conversations in which Graham explicitly threatened to destroy her if she ever left. "I always felt sorry for Mrs. Whitfield," Jeffrey said in his statement. "She was a kind woman. She didn't deserve what that family did to her." Graham's lawyers tried to have Jeffrey's testimony excluded, claiming he was a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. The judge, Honorable Thomas Ashford, with 28 years on the bench, was unimpressed. "The witness will be heard," he ruled. "His credibility is for the jury to assess." The documents were even worse than the testimonies. Priscilla's investigators had obtained financial records showing that Graham had systematically hidden assets during the divorce proceedings, potentially perjuring himself and defrauding Camille out of hundreds of thousands of dollars in the settlement. They had uncovered emails between Graham and his lawyers discussing strategies to intimidate and exhaust Camille into accepting an unfavorable agreement. And they had found evidence that Graham had hired a private investigator to follow Camille for months after the divorce, tracking her movements, photographing her with me, and compiling a dossier that he apparently intended to use for some future campaign of harassment. The PI, a man named Donald Vickers with a checkered professional history, was facing potential charges for invasion of privacy. He'd already agreed to cooperate with our legal team in exchange for leniency. His testimony added another layer to the pattern of stalking and obsession that Graham had maintained for years. 3 months into the litigation, Graham's lawyers approached Priscilla about settlement discussions. Their client, they said, was willing to drop all claims in exchange for a confidentiality agreement and no admission of wrongdoing. Priscilla brought the offer to me and Camille. We rejected it unanimously. "We want our day in court," Camille said, her voice steady. "I want everyone to know what he is. I want it on the public record. I want other women who've been in my position to see that men like Graham can be held accountable." Priscilla smiled. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." She sent the rejection back with a counteroffer. Full public admission of wrongdoing, a formal apology, and substantial damages to be donated to organizations supporting domestic abuse survivors. Graham's lawyers responded that their client would never agree to such terms. "We'll see you in court then," Priscilla replied. The trial was scheduled for 11 months after the incident. In the intervening time, Graham's life continued to unravel. His behavior at the award ceremony and the subsequent press conference had damaged his reputation in Portland's business community. Clients of Whitfield Development began quietly distancing themselves. Board members expressed concerns about having Graham involved in public-facing roles. His father, 81 years old and in declining health, was reportedly furious about the negative publicity Graham had brought to the family name. There were rumors of a possible ouster from the company, of Graham being bought out of his shares and pushed into permanent retirement. None of this softened Graham's position in the lawsuit. If anything, it hardened it. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and he seemed determined to take as many people down with him as possible. The week before the trial was scheduled to begin, something unexpected happened. I received a call from Officer Diana Krause, the police officer who had responded to the incident at the hotel. Mr. Reyes, she said, I thought you should know that we've received a complaint. Graham Whitfield claims you've been following him, that you've made threats against his safety. He's requesting a restraining order. I was genuinely confused. I hadn't been anywhere near Graham since the night of the ceremony. I had no interest in him whatsoever. What evidence does he have? Phone records showing calls from a blocked number. Photos of a vehicle he claims was parked outside his home. A letter he says he received threatening violence if he doesn't drop the lawsuit. Krause paused. For what it's worth, I don't believe a word of it. The letter was clearly fabricated, the handwriting doesn't match anything we have on file for you, and the photos show a vehicle registered to a rental company in Seattle that has no record of renting to you or anyone associated with you. She sighed. But Graham's lawyers are pushing hard. They want to use this to delay the trial, to paint you as the aggressor. I thanked her for the heads up and immediately called Priscilla. Priscilla Thornton had seen this tactic before. Fabricate evidence, file complaints, create enough smoke that people start to assume there's fire. It was a desperation move, she said. He knows he's going to lose, so he's trying to muddy the waters. Make it look like you're just as bad as he is. What do? We get ahead of it. She explained her strategy: proactive disclosure, aggressive investigation of the fabricated evidence, and a motion to sanction Graham's legal team for filing frivolous complaints. By the time we're done, she said, his credibility will be completely destroyed. She was right. Within 2 weeks, Priscilla's investigators had traced the rental car in Graham's photos to a private investigator hired by Graham himself, presumably to stage the surveillance and create false evidence of stalking. The blocked phone calls had originated from a burner phone purchased at a convenience store near Graham's residence, and the threatening letter contained phrases and terminology that matched Graham's own emails and text messages, suggesting he had written it himself. The judge was not amused. At a pre-trial hearing, Honorable Thomas Ashford reviewed the evidence of Graham's fabricated complaints and delivered a blistering rebuke. Mr. Whitfield, he said, his voice cold, you have wasted this court's time, you have filed false police reports, and you have attempted to manufacture evidence to influence these proceedings. These are serious offenses. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential perjury and filing false reports. Additionally, I am sanctioning your legal team $100,000 for their role in perpetuating these fabrications. Any further misconduct will result in immediate dismissal of your claims with prejudice. Graham sat motionless, his face ashen. His lead attorney tried to object, but the judge cut him off. We're done here. Trial proceeds as scheduled. I suggest your client use the remaining time to reconsider his position. The trial lasted 8 days. Priscilla presented a methodical, devastating case. Witness after witness testified to Graham's pattern of abuse and control during his marriage to Camille. Expert witnesses explained the psychology of coercive control, the long-term effects on survivors, the predictable escalation of behavior when abusers lose control of their victims. Financial experts documented the hidden assets, the fraudulent divorce settlement, the years of financial abuse. And then there was the security footage from the hotel, played in full for the jury, showing Graham's aggression, his wild swing, and my measured response. The defense tried to paint me as the aggressor, tried to suggest that I had somehow provoked Graham, that I had used excessive force. But under cross-examination, their own expert witnesses admitted that my actions were consistent with basic self-defense training, that I had used the minimum force necessary to subdue an attacker, and that Graham's injuries were largely the result of his own intoxication and poor physical condition rather than any brutality on my part. On the 7th day, Camille took the stand. She spoke for nearly 4 hours, describing in careful, controlled detail the reality of her marriage to Graham, the isolation, the constant criticism, the threats, the terror of finally leaving, and the years of harassment that followed. She talked about the divorce, about the systematic intimidation Graham's lawyers had subjected her to, about the settlement she'd accepted just to escape. And she talked about rebuilding her life, about starting her firm, about meeting me and learning to trust again. I didn't think I deserved happiness, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Graham convinced me that I was fundamentally broken, that no one would ever love me, that I was lucky he tolerated me at all. She looked at the jury, 12 strangers who had listened to a week of testimony. It took me years to understand that he was wrong, that I was never broken, that I was just trapped with someone who needed me to believe I was. The courtroom was silent when she finished. Even Graham's lawyers had stopped objecting. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found in our favor on every count. Graham was ordered to pay damages of $3.2 million, $1.5 million to Camille for emotional distress and the fraudulent divorce settlement, and the remainder to me for defamation and malicious prosecution. More importantly, the verdict was public. Every ugly detail of Graham's behavior was now part of the official record. The local news covered it extensively. National outlets picked up the story. Graham Whitfield, scion of one of Portland's wealthiest families, had been exposed as an abuser, a fraud, and a coward. The money almost didn't matter. What mattered was that people knew the truth. The aftermath came swiftly. Within a month of the verdict, Graham was removed from all positions at Whitfield Development. The board cited concerns about liability and reputation, but everyone knew the real reason. He had become toxic, untouchable. His father released a terse statement expressing disappointment in his son's conduct and announcing that Graham would have no further involvement in family business operations. The district attorney's office charged Graham with filing false police reports and perjury, misdemeanors that nonetheless carried the possibility of jail time. He pleaded no contest and received 2 years of probation and mandatory counseling. The private investigator he'd hired, Donald Vickers, lost his license and faced his own legal consequences. And Graham's ex-wife, his first ex-wife before Camille, came forward with her own story of abuse, a story that had been buried under non-disclosure agreements and settlement money. Other women followed. By the time the wave of revelations crested, Graham Whitfield's name had become synonymous with a particular kind of entitled cruelty, a cautionary tale, a villain in his own story. 6 months after the trial, Camille and I sat on the deck of our home in the hills above Portland. It was evening, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. Below us, the city sparkled in the gathering dusk. She was holding a glass of wine, her first in weeks. She'd been working constantly since the verdict, channeling her energy into her firm, into the foundation she'd established to support survivors of domestic abuse, into building a life that was entirely her own. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she asked. "What?" "The award ceremony. Standing on that stage, watching him get wheeled out on that stretcher." She smiled, a small, satisfied smile. "I spent years being afraid of him. Years. And then, in one night, I watched him completely self-destruct. Not because of anything I did, because of who he is. He couldn't handle seeing me succeed, couldn't handle being ignored. His own ego destroyed him." I nodded. Some people can't stand to see others happy, especially if they think they deserve that happiness instead. Camille was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and took my hand. "Thank you for being there that night, for standing between me and him. I would have fought my own battle eventually, but it meant everything that I didn't have to." I squeezed her hand. "That's what partners do. We show up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Last week I heard that Graham had moved to Arizona, somewhere in the desert, far from the city where his name had become a punchline, far from the family that had essentially disowned him, far from the women whose lives he'd damaged and the community he'd alienated. He was alone, which was probably what he'd always feared most. A man who had built his entire identity around power and control, now powerless, controlling nothing but his own isolation. I wish I could say I felt sorry for him. I didn't. Some people earn their suffering. Graham Whitfield had spent decades earning his. Camille won another award last month, Designer of the Year, from a national architecture magazine. This time, I was in the front row, and no one grabbed my shoulder. No one called her a downgrade or suggested she'd settled for less. The only sounds were applause and cameras and the voice of my wife, confident and powerful, accepting recognition for work that was entirely, undeniably her own. Afterward, she found me in the crowd and kissed me, long and slow, in front of everyone. "Upgraded," she whispered against my lips. That's what I did. I laughed and held her close, thinking about all the paths that had led us here, the pain and the healing and the love that had grown in the spaces where fear used to live. "He raised his fist," I said, "and you raised yourself right out of his reach." Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.